All right, so today we're going to be talking about the second part of social history during the Industrial Revolution. We're also going to delve a little bit into artistic history. So today we have two focuses. First, we're going to look at who made up the industrial working class, and we're going to talk about what life was like for them. Then what we're going to do is we're going to look at reactions to the Industrial Revolution. So we're going to look at how working class people and how middle class people responded to the Industrial Revolution and attempted to fix some of the problems. We're also going to look how artists reacted to the Industrial Revolution. All right, so first of all, who made up the industrial working class? Well, as you can probably imagine, we've talked a lot about the growth of the factory system and urbanization and all of that. So industrial factory workers were a really big part of the working class. And their work looked really different from those craftspeople who existed during the first half of our course, right? So rather than you sitting down in your workshop and building a chair start to finish in an industrial factory, you're maybe only making a little tiny part of that chair, right? So as you can imagine, work is pretty repetitive. Your days are going to be pretty long. But the working class was also more than just factory workers. It also included agricultural workers. We've talked about a shift to industry over agriculture, but obviously people still need to grow food, right? So there's still agricultural workers out there. The working class also included domestic servants. So all the people who worked in the homes of the middle class and the wealthy. Now, often these folks were women, and women also worked in agriculture, but they also worked in factories. So we have this kind of stereotype, I think, about industrial workers and factory workers, that they're all guys. But women did play a really significant role, right? Because oftentimes wages were so low that both men and women needed to work to keep their family fed, right? And women also played a really important role in the textile industry, which, as you recall, was one of really the focuses of the Industrial Revolution, especially towards the beginning. All right, what was life like for these people? Well, first of all, super long days. So probably you would work about 12 to 16 hours a day. You'd start really early in the morning before dawn. And you might be wondering, I think we all have kind of different perspectives on this. You're like, wait, well, if you're working 16 hours a day, well, aren't you making more money than if you're working 8? Well, I mean, that's true, right? But you have to kind of consider the trade-off of that's exhausting, especially when you're working in really poor conditions and then you've got a family to take care of, right? Moreover, people usually worked 6 days a week. You probably get Sunday morning off to go to church. Maybe you'd work Sunday afternoon. So not a lot of time for rest. The concept of the weekend doesn't really exist yet. That was something people had to fight for and earn. Working environments were usually really hot. They were dirty. They were physically dangerous. I'm actually going to use a U.S. history example here, but there's a really great book about the meatpacking industry in Chicago in the 19th century, end of the 19th century, early 20th century, called The Jungle. And there's accounts of various meatpacking workers accidentally, cutting off pieces of their hand and getting entangled in the machinery and all kinds of horrible things like that. There were no regulations on child labor, so you put those kids to work as soon as they were physically able to do so, and kids earned lower wages, so they were cheaper to pay. So that was a nice incentive for factory owners to send little 6-year-old girls out to go work in the textile factories. There was no minimum wage legislation at this time, so you got paid whatever the factory owner wanted to pay you, which was obviously not much. And there was no wage equality between men and women. So generally women worked, but there was this perception that they didn't need to earn as much as men. So that's fun. And moreover, sort of as an extra sort of kick in the teeth to women, women not only worked outside the home, they were also still kind of, traditional gender roles are still in play here. So women were typically expected to shoulder the entire household's duties and childcare burdens. So you'd work 16 hours a day at the factory, and then you get to go home and cook dinner for your whole family and put the kids to bed and change the diapers and, bandage your 5-year-old's injuries that she got trying to work in a textile factory. But on the other hand, so it's kind of easy to oversell how bad the Industrial Revolution was for the working class. It was really bad. Let me emphasize that. But there are definitely some historians who have argued that sort of in the long run, the Industrial Revolution was actually ultimately beneficial for everybody, including the working class, because over time it did actually raise wages. So people actually did tend to earn more money working in a factory than working on a farm. And then also the Industrial Revolution allowed for cheaper consumer goods, because if you're paying your workers pennies, you can produce things like clothing and plates and furniture for a lot cheaper than you would what if those things were made by hand, right? Think about the clothes you buy from the store versus from like an Etsy shop that someone hand sewed, right? Things you buy from the store are a lot cheaper because they're mass produced, right? And then the Industrial Revolution also raised countries' gross domestic product. So countries made a lot more stuff. It made them wealthier. So in the long run, people will say, actually, it was good. People kind of figured it out. There is some evidence for this kind of in the present day too. So sweatshop labor, like the type that they had during the Industrial Revolution, has actually helped improve the overall standard of living in countries such as Singapore. So a lot of East Asian countries that relied a lot on sweatshop labor in sort of like the middle of the 20th century have become significantly wealthy in the last few years or so. So that's kind of a positive. But I would say the wealthy and the middle class during the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century in Europe, I would say they benefited a lot more than the working class. And moreover, too, there were actually movements to reform conditions from the working class. These are they're going to come from both the working class themselves, so kind of these bottom-up movements, but they're also going to come from the government and from the middle class. And we've already kind of mentioned this a little bit before. The middle class wanted to reform conditions, not just out of the goodness of their hearts, but also because they were afraid that if working conditions were too bad, the working class would revolt, and that would be bad for society, right? So we're going to talk about a few of these bottom-up movements. I do want to point out, though, that these are sort of movements from the early and mid-19th century, and as we progress during this unit and the next unit, we're going to see some even bigger movements emerge from the working class later in the 19th century. So the working class is kind of like just starting to develop a class consciousness and just starting to develop these reform movements, and they're going to get bigger over time. So the first of these is the Luddites. So you might have heard that word to describe somebody who doesn't like technology. So if your dad is trying to figure out how to use TikTok and he can, you're like, oh, Dad, you're such a Luddite. But actually what it came from was this movement early on in the Industrial Revolution where skilled textile workers, so people were actually made, a garment start to finish probably in their homes, right? That part of the cottage industry. They were really afraid that technology, like the flying shuttle and mechanized looms and all of that would put them out of work, right? So people would fire half their or factory owners would fire half their workers who were skilled and replace them with unskilled people who could operate these machines. And so the Luddites were like, hey, our wages are going to go down. This is terrible. So what they did is they broke in and they smashed all the machines as a way of sort of protesting what they thought was going to happen. Sort of the modern day analogy for this is like self-checkout machines at the grocery store, right? If you own a grocery store, it might be cheaper for you to have like 2 cashiers and 5 self-checkout machines versus like 7 cashiers, right? So that's why some folks don't like to use self-checkout machines sometimes. So that's the Luddites. We're also going to see during this time really the beginning of trade unions, which still exist today. Not really many Luddites, aside from people who don't like self-checkout machines. But trade unions were organization of workers. In the beginning, it was really only skilled workers. And unions, their whole goal was to fight for higher wages and better working conditions for their members, right? So for example, maybe they would say, hey, we don't want to work 16 hours a day. We want to work 8 hours a day. And we want safety protections. And we want hard hats and various things like that, right? As I mentioned, it was really initially limited to certain skilled trades, but people like Robert Owen and others began to push for trade unions that brought together workers from all sorts of trades, right? So skilled, unskilled, everybody working together to gain better working conditions. So unions are going to become, they're just kind of starting out now, but they're going to become a lot bigger later in the 19th century. So we'll talk about that too. And last but not least, we're going to look at the Chartists. And this was actually a political movement. So their whole goal wasn't just to establish like better working conditions. Their main goal was to enable better working class participation in the political system. So what they wanted to do was to establish universal male suffrage. So it used to be in Britain that you could only vote if you were wealthy and you owned property. But the Chartists were like, no, that's not fair. We want to make sure that everybody's able to vote, or every man is able to vote, regardless of how much money they have, regardless if they own property. This movement didn't last very long. It fizzled out by the late 1840s or so, but it set a really important precedent. So this was the first really big, significant movement to push to expand voting access. So again, that's going to be a trend that we're going to kind of see blossom in the later half of the 19th century. So we'll come back to that as well. So really keep an eye on those people who are fighting for better working conditions and those people who are fighting for greater access to political participation, because they're maybe not winning big gains right now, but they're going to come back later and win even bigger ones later. All right, now let's talk about people who attempted to reform from the top down. So we've already kind of looked at some things like food and drug safety legislation, public health legislation. Let's take a look at some more. So from 1802 to 1819, there were several factory acts that were passed, and as you can probably tell from the name, their whole point was to sort of reform working conditions in factories. So specifically what they did is they limited 9 to 16-year-olds, so children and young teenagers, to working only 12 hours a day. Gee, that's great. 12-hour work days for 9-year-olds. And they banned factories, or at least cotton factories, cotton mills specifically, from employing children under 9. So your child can still be a chimney sweep, but yeah, they can't work at a cotton mill and get their hair caught in a lathe. So that's positive. In 1833, there was another factory act, and what that did is it strengthened earlier factory acts, so those 1802, 1819 ones, and it further reduced working hours. And it also increased enforcement powers of the government, because kind of early on, right, the government would say, hey, factories. By the way, these are all happening in Britain. Didn't mention that, but these are all British. It's going to take a while for the continent to catch up, as kind of is the trend in this century. So at first, the government would say, hey, don't employ 8-year-olds, and they would kind of turn a blind eye if factory owners did in fact employ 8-year-olds. But with the Factory Act of 1833, the government was like, okay, we're going to come investigate your factory and see if you're employing some 8-year-olds. Later on, 1847, we have the 10 Hours Act, which is exactly what it says on the tin. It reduced working hours now for adult women, so we're including them now, and children. What's kind of interesting about this, you can also see sort of those Victorian Industrial Revolution gender norms there. Like, oh, women, so delicate. Maybe we should limit their working hours so they can go back in the kitchen. Kind of mixed bag there. And then these are out of order. I apologize. The Coal Mines Act of 1842, so that should probably go first. That prohibited the employment of boys under 10, as well as women in coal mines. So again, we're seeing kind of a trend here that, as we mentioned, right, at the very beginning of this unit, sort of there's this emerging theme in Victorian Britain that like women and children maybe do need to be protected. That's one of those middle-class values types of things. All right, now let's look at some artistic reactions. So artists and writers, they're not really out there in the streets protesting for, better legislation or working conditions or anything like that, really. But they are reacting to the Industrial Revolution. They are looking at it and being like, I'm not sure how much of a positive development this is. So really the biggest artistic movement to emerge during this time period is one you guys actually already know about because you read Frankenstein in English in the fall, right? And this is Romanticism. So this was an artistic and literary movement that responded in a pretty negative way, I would say, to both the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment. So it was kind of a reaction to both of those things at once. And what it did is it championed emotion and feeling, and it really criticized the Enlightenment's reliance on reason and science. So this whole idea that if you try and look at the world through this really rationalized lens and you don't let yourself feel feelings, that's bad. You won't really understand the world. Romanticism really celebrated the past as well. So I had this whole thing like this, a lot of romantics really liked folk tales, like the Brothers Grimm, for example. And there was this real feeling of nostalgia. There was this idea that society had changed so much because of the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, and that we needed to go back to some kind of simpler time. Another really good example of this is there is a composer, so there are actually a lot of romantic composers too, named Richard Wagner, and he's really famous for writing these operas that sort of celebrated this ancient Germanic folklore and Arthurian legend and all of that stuff, and it was all about how industry has ruined the world and we need to go back to this great and beautiful past, yada, yada, yada. The Romantics hated those new industrial cities, although how could you not? They smelled. And they really celebrated nature, right? So not only do they want this return to the past, they want a return to nature and beauty. And they celebrated how sublime nature was and all of that, right? Now, Romanticism also had kind of a dark and spooky side. Again, that kind of goes along with this idea, like kind of like nostalgia and feeling. This was typically, so this is a big part of like Gothic fiction, for example, which is a subgenre of Romanticism, which actually Frankenstein is. So we're actually going to look a little bit more at Romanticism in a bit, so stay tuned.